The chamber was designed to make individuals feel small. That had been intentional. The architects of the conclave of sovereign systems had built it that way 10,000 years ago, tier upon tier of curved seating rising into a ceiling so high it disappeared into a soft, artificial haze. Light filtered down in pale shafts, diffused just enough to blur edges and soften detail, so that no single figure could dominate the space. Unless the chamber allowed it. Today it did not. At the center platform stood one human. Ambassador Lena Arcturus did not sit. She had been offered a seat, protocol required it, but she had declined with quiet politeness. Sitting felt like waiting. And she had spent enough years in this chamber waiting for outcomes that never came. So she stood. Alone. Around her, hundreds of species filled the ascending rings. Some were massive, their bulk supported by reinforced platforms. Others were small and clustered together in shared enclosures, their translators flickering as they communicated in bursts of color, vibration, or sound. A few did not appear physically at all, represented only by hovering projection fields that shimmered faintly in the air. They spoke. They debated. They negotiated. But not about her. Not anymore. Above the central platform, the result of the vote hovered in steady, indifferent light. 317 against. 52 in favor. The numbers did not flicker. They did not soften. They simply remained. The Orion Transit Corridor petition, humanity's request for a neutral trade zone, had been denied. For the fourth time in 6 standard cycles. Lena looked at the display for a long moment. Not searching for hope. Not expecting error. Just confirming what she had already known before the vote had even been cast. Behind her, in the small delegation alcove assigned to humanity, her aide shifted slightly but said nothing. He had learned, over the years, that silence was often the most appropriate response in this chamber. At the far end of the platform, a senior mediator rose. High Chancellor Velker Thane, ancient, composed, practiced. His species had governed procedural balance within the conclave longer than most civilizations had existed. His voice, when it came, was smooth and measured, shaped by centuries of repetition. The motion is denied, he said. No emphasis. No apology. The Orion Corridor will remain under shared jurisdiction. The Terran request has been recorded for future review. Future review. The phrase moved through the chamber like background noise, familiar, unremarkable, easily ignored. Lena did not react. She had heard those words so many times they had lost all meaning years ago. Around the chamber, attention had already shifted. Displays changed. Delegates leaned toward one another, resuming discussions about trade adjustments, territorial clarifications, resource allocations. The next matter. The next vote. The next negotiation. As if nothing of consequence had just happened. As if a request submitted, revised, defended and resubmitted over 6 years had not just been dismissed in under a minute. A delegate from the Ketheri cluster passed near the platform edge, glancing briefly in Lena's direction. There was something in the look, recognition, perhaps. Or something smaller. The quiet acknowledgement of a decision that had been easy to make because it did not affect them. He did not stop. No one did. Lena exhaled slowly. Not frustration. Not anger. Something closer to completion. Then, without asking for recognition, without requesting the floor, she stepped down from the central platform. No announcement marked her movement. No one called her back. By the time she reached the human delegation alcove, the chamber had already moved on. And that, more than the vote, more than the numbers, more than the words, was the problem. The corridor outside the chamber was quiet. Not silent. Nothing in the conclave ever truly was, but quieter than the endless layered noise of the assembly hall. The walls here absorbed sound, smoothing it into a low hum that made footsteps feel distant, almost unreal. Lena Arcturus walked through it without slowing. Behind her, the doors to the chamber sealed with a soft, final sound. No one followed. That, too, was expected. Her aide, Rian Patel, fell into step beside her, holding a data slate against his chest. He didn't speak immediately. He waited until they had turned the second corner, until the chamber was fully out of sight. Same result. he said quietly. Lena gave a small nod. Same result. There was no frustration in her voice. No disbelief. Just confirmation. They reached the delegation suite, a modest space compared to the elaborate quarters assigned to older, more influential species. A single table. For chairs. A wide window overlooking the layered skyline of the conclave capital. For 6 years, this had been her operational center. For 6 years, she had believed it mattered. Rian moved to the side console, setting the data slate down. I can prepare an appeal draft, he offered. We could request a procedural review. There are still... No, Lena said. Not sharply. Just final. Rian stopped. He looked at her then, not confused, not questioning. Just recalibrating. He had worked with her long enough to recognize tone. This wasn't strategy. This was conclusion. Lena stepped toward the table and activated her personal communicator. The interface lit up instantly, already aligned to a secured channel. Prepared. Waiting. That, more than anything, made Rian's chest tighten slightly. You wrote it already, he said. Lena didn't answer immediately. She looked at the screen for a moment, a single line of text displayed in the center. Precise. Unavoidable. They won't move, she read quietly. Then she added, almost to herself. Not now. Not ever. Rian exhaled slowly. If we send that... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lena finally looked at him. For the first time since leaving the chamber, there was something different in her expression. Not anger, not frustration. Certainty. We've been asking for 6 years, she said. We've been accommodating for 2 centuries. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the window, toward the distant structures of a system that had never truly seen them. They understand both as weakness. Silence settled between them. Not heavy. Not uncertain. Just clear. Rian gave a small nod. Then this is it, he said. Lena looked back to the screen. Her finger hovered for only a fraction of a second. The message disappeared instantly, encrypted and transmitted across distances that most species still relied on human-built infrastructure to cross. No confirmation ping followed. No dramatic signal. Just absence. Rian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. How long? For what? Lena asked. For them to respond. Lena powered down the communicator. They already have. Rian frowned slightly. We just sent it. Yes, she said. And they already have. She turned away from the table, moving toward the storage wall where years of reports, agreements, drafts, and proposals were neatly archived. All of this, she said calmly, gesturing to the room, only exists if they believe it matters. Rian felt it then. Not in her words. In the tone behind them. Something had shifted. Not externally. Internally. What do you need me to do? He asked. Lena didn't hesitate. Start packing. Rian blinked once. Packing as in? As in everything, she said. Documents. Devices. Personal items. Archive copies. She paused briefly, then added. We're leaving in the morning. This time, the silence that followed was different. Not uncertainty. Not confusion. Understanding. Rian nodded once. Understood. He turned immediately, already moving toward the storage systems. No more questions. No more alternatives. Behind him, Lena stood still for a moment longer. Then she looked once, just once, back toward the direction of the chamber. Not with regret. Not with anger. Just acknowledgement. The decision had not been made today. Today had only made it visible. The chamber was full again. Another session. Another cycle. Another list of matters that, to most of the delegates present, carried far more immediate importance than a denied corridor request from a species that had already spoken its piece. The conclave moved forward. It always did. At least, that's what they believed. High Chancellor Velker Thane stood at the central dais, reviewing the opening sequence for the session. His posture was as composed as ever, his expression carefully neutral. Nothing in the chamber suggested disruption. Until the doors opened. They did not open dramatically. No announcement preceded it. No signal marked it. They simply parted. And a human walked in. Ambassador Lena Arcturus moved at a steady, unhurried pace across the vast floor. No escort. No delegation. No visible preparation. Just her. A few delegates near the lower tiers glanced up, more out of reflex than interest. Humans had spoken here many times before. They were persistent. Predictable. Velker noticed her halfway to the platform. A slight shift in his posture, nothing more. She was not scheduled to speak. Protocol required recognition before approaching the dais. He was already preparing the phrase to redirect her. She stepped onto the platform anyway. That, more than anything, caused the chamber to pause. Not silence. Not yet. But a subtle disturbance, like a ripple moving across still water. Ambassador, Velker began smoothly, the floor is currently. Lena did not interrupt him. She didn't need to. She simply reached into her coat and removed a thin, silver card. Her diplomatic credentials. The seal of the Terran Confederation shimmered briefly under the chamber lights. Then she placed it on the platform. Carefully. Deliberately. Like something that would not be picked up again. Now the chamber was silent. Not fully. But close enough that the absence of sound became noticeable. Velker stopped speaking. For the first time in decades, he did not immediately continue. Lena looked out across the tiers. Hundreds of species. Thousands of representatives. All watching now. Finally. Her voice, when it came, was calm. Unforced. The Terran Confederation, she said, is withdrawing from all diplomatic engagement with the conclave of sovereign systems. No emphasis. No anger. No performance. Effective immediately. The words settled into the chamber without resistance. For a moment, nothing happened. No response. No interruption. Because there was no protocol for this. In 10,000 years of recorded conclave history, no member species had ever simply left. Disputes had escalated. Conflicts had fractured alliances. But no one had stood at the center of the chamber. And walked away. Velker opened his mouth slightly. Closed it again. Around him, representatives shifted, exchanging glances, querying their aides, searching for some procedural anchor that did not exist. This action, one delegate began, then stopped. Because what exactly was it? Illegal? There was no rule. Unacceptable? By whose authority? Preventable? Lena did not wait for them to decide. She had already finished. She turned, stepped down from the platform, and began walking toward the exit. No guards moved to stop her. No voices called after her. No one knew what to say. Behind her, the chamber remained suspended in a state it had never experienced before. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that does not come from conflict, but from the sudden absence of something that had always been assumed. At the doors, Lena paused for half a second. Not to look back. Not to reconsider. Just long enough for the system to register her exit request. The doors opened. She walked through. And this time, they did not follow. The chamber stayed silent long after she was gone. Not because they respected the moment, but because they did not yet understand it. At first, nothing happened. The conclave resumed its session 23 minutes after Ambassador Lena Arcturus exited the chamber. There was a brief procedural delay, a minor dispute over whether her statement should be recorded as a formal withdrawal or an unverified declaration. It was eventually classified as pending verification, which allowed the agenda to continue without disruption. And so it did. Trade disputes were discussed. Resource allocations were negotiated. Boundary clarifications were filed. The machine moved forward just as it always had. The first anomaly appeared 12 hours later. It was small, routine, easy to ignore. A cargo vessel scheduled to depart from Relay Port K-17 failed to undock at its assigned time. The Port Authority issued a standard inquiry, and the response arrived within minutes. Departure delayed. Maintenance review in progress. No revised schedule available. The message was polite, properly formatted, and entirely unremarkable. The delay was logged. No escalation was triggered. Delays happened. Then it happened again. And again. Across 3 different ports, involving different vessels on unrelated routes, the same pattern repeated. The same message. The same tone. The same absence of urgency. By the end of the first day, 12 human-operated freight vessels remained docked across key transit hubs. There were no distress signals, no system failures, no emergency declarations. The ships were fully operational, fully staffed, and completely still. It's a scheduling issue, one Conclave logistics coordinator said during a routine briefing. Possibly a labor dispute. No one challenged the explanation. It sounded reasonable, and more importantly, it required no immediate action. On the second day, the pattern widened. 2 additional cargo routes reported delays. Then 5. Then 9. Nothing had failed. Nothing had broken. Ships that should have moved simply did not. At Central Trade Exchange Vorth, a shipment of agricultural compounds failed to arrive. The receiving world submitted a polite inquiry. The response was immediate. Shipment delayed. No estimated time of arrival. No explanation. No apology. Just information. It's inefficient, a delegate from the Viral Consortium noted during an afternoon session. But not disruptive. At that moment, they believed that. By the third day, it became harder to ignore. 31% of scheduled cargo movement along outer transit corridors had slowed or stopped. Not collapsed. Not failed. Just paused. That's statistically abnormal, an analyst reported to a mid-level conclave committee. Then flag it for observation, the committee chair replied. No emergency session was called. No system-wide alert was issued. Because nothing had technically broken. Every report remained clean. Every system was operational. Every delay was voluntary. On the 4th day, 3 deep-range relay stations went offline simultaneously. There was no warning, no malfunction, just a formal notification. Scheduled maintenance cycle initiated. Duration, indefinite. That was the first moment concern truly surfaced. Not panic. Not yet. But concern. Those relay stations handled long-range navigation calibration across multiple high-density routes. Without them, travel didn't stop, but it became uncertain, unpredictable, and expensive. Insurance providers reacted first. Premiums increased. Routes were reconsidered. Captains began delaying departures. Still, no official crisis. They're within their rights, a legal advisor confirmed during an internal review. All affected infrastructure is under Terran maintenance jurisdiction. So they can just stop? A council member asked. They haven't stopped, the advisor corrected. They've reprioritized. That distinction lingered longer than anyone expected. On the 5th day, the medical shipments began to stall. Not everywhere. Not dramatically. Just enough. A delay here. A missed delivery there. A hospital requesting clarification and receiving the same answer. In transit. No revised arrival time. That was when the tone began to shift. Subtly. Quietly. But unmistakably. Trade delays could be tolerated. Economic fluctuations could be managed. But medical uncertainty was different. Still, no one used the word crisis. Because nothing had collapsed. Nothing had failed. Nothing had broken. Everything was still there. The ships, the systems, the infrastructure. They simply weren't moving. And for the first time, a question began to form. Not loudly. Not officially. But persistently. What happens if they don't start again? No one answered it. Because no one yet understood. The answer had already begun. By the 6th day, the word delay was no longer sufficient. It still appeared in official reports, still phrased carefully, still framed in neutral language, but no one reading those reports believed it anymore. The numbers had grown too large. 43% of intersystem cargo movement across primary corridors had slowed or stopped. Not randomly. Not evenly. The pattern was precise, almost surgical. Every disrupted route shared a single common factor: human infrastructure, human crews, human systems. And without them, movement didn't cease entirely, it degraded. Rapidly. At Conclave Central Logistics, The Situation Board had already expanded twice in a single cycle to accommodate incoming data. Entire sectors began shifting from green to amber, and from amber to red, not because systems were failing, but because they were no longer being supported. That distinction mattered less with each passing hour. Food shipments to 3 outer colony clusters were now 4 days behind schedule. Not critical yet, but approaching it. Agricultural reserves were being recalculated, consumption models adjusted, quietly, so as not to trigger panic. In the Vathari medical networks, the problem escalated faster. Baseline pharmaceutical compounds, stabilizers used across dozens of species with incompatible biologies, had not arrived at their expected intervals. Most worlds maintained reserves, but those reserves had been calculated based on predictable resupply. Predictability was gone. Hospital administrators began issuing internal advisories. Not public. Not yet. At Kepler Trade Junction, one of the busiest commercial hubs in the outer lanes, dock supervisors watched as entire rows of freight vessels remained powered down. Not abandoned. Not damaged. Just idle, waiting, or choosing not to move. This is coordinated, a senior trade analyst finally said during a closed conclave briefing. No one argued. Because at this point, there was nothing left to argue. High Chancellor Velker Thanes stood at the edge of the central display, reviewing the latest projections. His expression remained composed, but the cadence of incoming reports had changed. These were no longer routine updates. They were patterns, and patterns demanded interpretation. What percentage of affected systems are directly tied to Terran operations? He asked. The analyst hesitated, not because she didn't have the answer, but because of how it would sound when spoken aloud. 61%, she said. After a brief pause, she added, indirect impact raises that to approximately 82. The room went quiet. Not shocked, just recalculating. Alternatives, Velker said. Available, another advisor responded quickly, but limited. Other species operate freight networks, but not at comparable scale or efficiency. And relay maintenance? Fragmented, the advisor admitted. Most deep-range calibration systems were designed by Terran engineering groups. We can attempt to compensate, but we don't have the personnel to sustain it long-term. Across the chamber, more reports continued to arrive, each one manageable on its own, but together forming something far more serious. In the Drell Merchant Consortium, economic models were revised for the 3rd time in 48 hours. Profit projections shifted into loss containment scenarios. Insurance risk assessments were rewritten entirely. Captains began refusing routes without stable relay calibration, and investors quietly pulled capital from sectors dependent on long-range transport. This is a disruption tactic, one council member said. Velker did not respond immediately. The word tactic implied intention, and intention implied communication. They haven't issued any demands, another voice added. No conditions. No negotiation requests. Velker finally spoke. That's because this isn't a negotiation. The room turned toward him. They are not asking for leverage, he said calmly. They are demonstrating absence. The phrase settled heavily, because it reframed everything. This wasn't pressure. It wasn't escalation. It wasn't retaliation. It was subtraction. And the conclave system, vast, interconnected, ancient, was beginning to reveal what happened when a foundational layer was quietly removed. Another report appeared on the display. 3 more relay stations scheduled for maintenance, effective immediately. Chancellor, the analyst said carefully, if this continues at the current rate, we project full disruption of outer corridor logistics within 12 days. 12 days until collapse? Someone asked. The analyst shook her head. No. 12 days until we can no longer pretend this isn't one. No one spoke after that. Because the illusion, the assumption that the conclave system was self-sustaining, was beginning to fracture. And within that fracture, a realization started to form. Slow, reluctant, but unavoidable. For centuries, humanity had participated, built, maintained, and supported, without demanding recognition proportional to contribution, without forcing the system to acknowledge its dependency. And now, without raising a single voice, They had removed themselves. Velker looked across the display one final time, at the stalled routes, the silent ships, the growing red zones. Then he asked the question no one in the room wanted to answer. "What," he said quietly, "have we been relying on, without ever measuring it?" No one answered, because they were already beginning to understand. The answer was far larger than they had ever imagined. The first to truly understand what was happening was not a politician, not a military commander, and not a trade official. It was an analyst. Senior intelligence observer Kale Virex had spent the last 30 years studying interspecies systems, patterns of cooperation, dependency networks, economic flows. His work was not glamorous, but it was precise, and precision was what the moment required. He did not begin with assumptions. He began with data. 3 days after the conclave officially acknowledged system-wide disruption conditions, Kale isolated himself in a secured analysis chamber and requested full access to Terran-linked infrastructure records. Not summaries. Not filtered reports. Everything. What came back was incomplete. Not because the data didn't exist. Because no one had ever thought to compile it this way. For centuries, human contributions had been categorized separately, engineering contracts in one archive, medical agreements in another, logistics support scattered across dozens of independent systems. Each piece had been recorded, acknowledged, filed. But never connected. Kale began connecting them. At first, the pattern looked like coincidence. Human engineering firms appeared frequently in relay station construction logs, but so did other species. Human freight operators handled a large share of cargo movement, but not exclusively. Human mediators were present in conflict resolution records, but rarely credited officially. Individually, none of it was dominant. Together, it was overwhelming. By the end of the first analysis cycle, Kale stopped labeling his findings as contributions. He relabeled them as dependencies. Human engineers had designed or co-designed 68% of deep-range relay calibration systems currently in use. Not just built them, understood them at a level no other species had fully replicated. Without ongoing Terran maintenance, degradation was not a possibility. It was a certainty. Human freight networks accounted for just under half of all high-efficiency cargo movement across primary corridors. But more importantly, they filled the gaps, routes that were unprofitable, difficult, or too complex for others to maintain consistently. Human medical suppliers provided baseline compounds to 41 species. Not specialized treatments, foundational stabilizers that made advanced medicine possible in the first place. There were alternatives, technically, but none matched Terran production scale or distribution reliability. And then there were the records that weren't supposed to matter. Uncredited mediation logs. Quiet interventions. Disputes that had resolved themselves according to official conclave documentation. Kale cross-referenced timelines. They hadn't resolved themselves. Humans had resolved them. Quietly. Without attribution. Without leverage. Without record, except in fragments scattered across systems no one had ever thought to unify. He leaned back from the display slowly. Not shocked. Not overwhelmed. Just recalibrating. The problem was not that humanity had been powerful. The problem was that no one had measured how much of that power had been quietly embedded into the system itself. Kale initiated a secondary query, projection modeling. What happens, he asked the system, if Terran involvement remains at 0% for 90 days? The simulation ran. It did not take long. Supply chains fractured first, not catastrophically, but progressively. Redundancies failed under sustained load. Secondary networks became primary networks and then collapsed under demand they had never been designed to handle. Medical shortages followed, not immediate mass failure, but a steady erosion of care quality across multiple species. Mortality projections ticked upward in small, controlled increments that became statistically significant over time. Economic instability spread unevenly, hitting outer systems harder than core worlds. Trade imbalances widened. Insurance systems destabilized. Long-range transport became increasingly restricted to high-risk operators. And through all of it, there was no single point of collapse. just a system slowly losing coherence. Kale stopped the simulation before it completed. He didn't need the final numbers. He understood the trajectory. He compiled his findings into a report. He did not exaggerate. He did not dramatize. He simply connected the data points and allowed the conclusion to emerge. Then he sent it directly to High Chancellor Velker Thane. No intermediaries. No filtering. Within 2 hours, he was summoned. Velker's private chamber was quieter than the main council halls, insulated from the constant flow of information that now defined the conclave's operational state. The chancellor stood near a projection wall when Kale entered, the report already open. "You verified these numbers?" Velker asked without turning. "Yes," Kale replied. "Across multiple independent datasets." Velker was silent for a moment. Why was this not identified earlier? Kale considered the question carefully. "Because no one was looking for it," he said. Each system evaluated human involvement within its own scope. No one aggregated the data across sectors. And if they had? They would have seen dependency, Kale said. But dependency is difficult to acknowledge when it is distributed. Velker finally turned. "What you're describing," he said slowly, "is not influence." "No," Kale agreed. "It's infrastructure." The words settled between them. Because infrastructure was not optional. Infrastructure was not negotiable. Infrastructure was what everything else was built on. Velker looked back at the report. "They didn't leverage this," he said. "No," Kale replied. "They never used it." "No." Another pause. "Why?" Kale didn't answer immediately. Because the question wasn't about data. It was about understanding intent. Finally, he said, "Because they didn't need to." Velker's gaze sharpened slightly. "Or," Kale added quietly, "because they assumed cooperation was enough." The room fell still. For the first time since the disruptions began, the situation had a shape. Not chaos. Not attack. Something far more controlled. Humanity had not disrupted the system. They had stepped away from it. And in doing so, they had revealed what had always been there. By the time Kale Virex's report circulated through the upper levels of the conclave, the tone had changed. Not publicly. Not in official statements. But in the rooms where decisions were actually made, the language shifted from confusion to something quieter and far more dangerous. Understanding. High Chancellor Velker Thane authorized a full historical audit of Terran involvement across conclave systems. Not a summary. Not a diplomatic overview. A complete reconstruction of 2 centuries of participation. What came back was not a report. It was an accounting. And it did not present itself all at once. It emerged in layers, each one building on the last, each one making the previous easier to dismiss, and the next impossible to ignore. The first layer was infrastructure. Human engineering groups had not simply contributed to the relay network, they had shaped its architecture. The redundancy systems, the calibration logic, the adaptive routing protocols that allowed vessels from radically different species to navigate shared space safely, those were Terran designs. Other species had built upon them, modified them, expanded them. But the foundation was human. Remove the foundation, and the structure did not collapse instantly. It destabilized. Quietly. Progressively. Exactly as it was now. The second layer was logistics. Human freight networks did not dominate trade volume on paper. That had been the assumption. If they were not the largest, they could not be the most important. The assumption had been wrong. They were the connective layer. They handled routes that were inefficient, unstable, or strategically inconvenient. They moved goods between systems that larger networks bypassed. They filled the gaps that no one else considered worth maintaining. Without those gaps being filled, the larger networks did not function smoothly. They fractured. The third layer was medical. 41 species relied on Terran baseline compounds, not because they were the only option, but because they were the most consistent. The production chains were stable. The distribution networks were reliable. The formulations were adaptable across biological variances. Other suppliers existed. None operated at that scale. None with that consistency. The fourth layer was the one that unsettled Velker the most. It was not infrastructure. It was not logistics. It was not even medicine. It was mediation. For over a century, disputes recorded as internally resolved showed subtle anomalies in timing, language patterns, and outcome structures. Cale's team cross-referenced communication logs, private negotiation archives, and independent observation records. The conclusion was unavoidable. Humans had been present, not officially, not as recognized arbiters, but as quiet participants who guided discussions, clarified positions, and, more often than not, prevented escalation before it reached the conclave floor. They had done the work, and then stepped back so others could take credit for the resolution. Velker read that section twice, then a third time. Not because he doubted it, because he needed to understand what kind of species did that consistently, without leveraging it, without documenting it, without demanding acknowledgement. The answer did not fit any model the conclave had built. They treated contribution as obligation, Cale said during the follow-up briefing. Velker did not look up from the report. And recognition? Optional, Cale replied. That word lingered longer than any statistic. Optional. In a system where most species negotiated for advantage, protected leverage, and measured every action in terms of gain, humans had operated differently. They had built, maintained, stabilized, and asked in return for something the conclave had classified as low priority. Fair access, equal consideration, a neutral corridor. 3 requests, 3 denials. Velker closed the report slowly. Around him, the chamber remained quiet, not with uncertainty this time, but with the weight of clarity. They were not a minor participant, one council member said carefully. No, Velker replied. They were the stabilizing layer. Another voice spoke, lower. And we treated them as background. No one corrected that, because there was nothing to correct. The realization did not come with anger. It did not come with panic. It came with something far more difficult to manage. Reassessment. Every assumption about power within the conclave had been built on visible metrics: fleet size, economic output, territorial reach. Humanity had not dominated any of those categories. So they had been categorized accordingly. Moderate influence. Valuable but replaceable. Important but not essential. That classification now sat in direct conflict with reality. Not because humans had changed, because the conclave had finally measured what had always been there. Velker stood and moved toward the central display. The disruption map still showed expanding zones of instability, trade routes slowing, medical shipments delaying, relay networks degrading. But now, for the first time, he was not looking at the symptoms. He was looking at the absence behind them. They did not build leverage, he said quietly. They built dependence. Cale did not correct him, because it was almost true. Almost. They built systems, Cale said instead, and we chose to depend on them. Velker's gaze remained on the display. That distinction mattered, because dependence could be exploited, but systems? Systems could simply be withdrawn. And there was nothing in conclave law, protocol, or precedent that could force their return. For the first time in 10,000 years of recorded governance, the conclave faced a problem it could not negotiate, could not regulate, and could not ignore. Not because it lacked authority, because it had never understood what it was relying on. No, it was gone. The incident began as a routine violation. At least, that was how it was logged. A mid-range extraction fleet from the hegemony industrial bloc crossed into the outer Orion corridor, a region that had been under dispute for years and, more recently, the subject of Terran withdrawal from conclave arbitration. The fleet consisted of 6 mining vessels and 2 armed escorts, standard for operations in contested space, though the presence of military support was not subtle. Their objective was equally standard: survey first, claim later. Under conclave precedent, such actions typically triggered prolonged legal disputes, procedural delays, and diplomatic exchanges that could last for cycles. Enforcement was inconsistent, and outcomes often depended on influence. The hegemony had influence. And for the first 6 hours, nothing stopped them. No warnings were issued. No conclave enforcement vessels responded. No Terran communication appeared on any channel. The mining vessels deployed scanning arrays and began preliminary mapping of a dense asteroid cluster well within the boundary coordinates previously claimed by the Terran Confederation. From a procedural standpoint, it was an opening move. From a strategic standpoint, it was a test. The response came without escalation. 3 Terran Defense Fleet destroyers entered the corridor at precisely 6:12 local transit time. There was no hyperspace flare, no aggressive maneuvering. They decelerated smoothly into position between the hegemony fleet and the asteroid cluster, maintaining a distance that was neither confrontational nor passive. They did not lock weapons. They did not deploy countermeasures. They simply positioned themselves in the one place that mattered most. A transmission followed on an open, unencrypted frequency, clear enough for every vessel in the region to receive. You are operating within Terran sovereign space. You have 4 hours to withdraw under your own power. This message will not be repeated. That was all. No reference to conclave law. No threat of force. No negotiation window. Just a statement and a clock. On board the lead hegemony escort, Commander Reth Karn reviewed the transmission twice, then a third time. He had expected resistance. He had prepared for escalation. He had not prepared for this. They haven't armed weapons, his tactical officer noted. I can see that, Karn replied. There was a brief pause. Orders. Karn did not answer immediately because the situation did not match any standard engagement model. There was no aggression to counter, no demand to negotiate, no visible uncertainty to exploit. The Terran vessels held position with perfect stability, their formation precise, their presence absolute in a way that felt deliberate. They're bluffing, another officer said, though the confidence behind the statement was thin. Karn studied the sensor data again. Energy signatures were minimal. Weapon systems inactive. No targeting locks. No shield escalation. Nothing that indicated imminent combat. And yet something about the stillness felt wrong. They're not bluffing, Karn said quietly. How can you tell? He didn't look away from the display. Because they're not trying to convince us of anything. That was the problem. Bluffs required performance, signals, pressure, intent to influence. This had none of those things. For several minutes, the corridor remained suspended in tension. The hegemony escorts powered their weapon systems to standby levels, not active targeting, but enough to signal readiness. The Terran destroyers did not respond. They did not adjust position. They did not acknowledge the escalation. They remained exactly where they were, unchanged. Time passed slowly. The 4-hour window remained in effect. No reminders. No updates. No additional communication. Karn felt it then. Not fear in the traditional sense, but something less familiar. Certainty. Not his own. The Terran vessels were not posturing. They were not negotiating. They were not waiting to see what he would do. They had already decided. Stand down, Karn said. The command bridge froze. Commander. Stand down, he repeated. All vessels. Withdraw from the corridor. No one argued. In that moment, every officer understood the same thing he did. If they crossed the line, there would be no second message. The hegemony fleet powered down its forward systems and began a controlled retreat. The mining vessels followed without protest. No shots were fired. No systems were damaged. No official report would classify the encounter as a conflict. And yet every observer who reviewed the footage later reached the same conclusion. The outcome had never been in doubt. The Terran destroyers held position until the last hegemony vessel cleared the boundary. Then, without comment, they adjusted formation and resumed patrol. No pursuit. No warning. No acknowledgement. The corridor returned to silence. But it was not the same silence as before. Now it had context. When the report reached the conclave, it was reviewed in complete silence. Not because it was unclear, but because it was unmistakably clear. There had been no negotiation, no escalation, no conflict, just a line, and a species that did not need to raise its voice to enforce it. The broadcast began without announcement. No pre-signal, no priority alert, no diplomatic notice. It simply appeared simultaneously across every major communication channel in the known systems, civilian networks, trade relays, private terminals, and even conclave infrastructure. The signal was clean, stable, and carried a strength that immediately suggested something new had been built to support it. That detail did not go unnoticed. Across worlds and stations, conversations paused. Operators turned toward their displays. In the conclave tower, High Chancellor Velker Thane stood still as the feed resolved into a single, familiar figure. Ambassador Lena Arcturus. She was not in a chamber or ceremonial hall. She sat at a plain table in what appeared to be a working office. Behind her, star maps shifted slowly across a projection wall, dynamic and active, not decorative. She looked like someone in the middle of ongoing work, not someone making an appeal. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across every system. For 2 centuries, the Terran Confederation has participated in the conclave framework in good faith. We have contributed infrastructure, logistics, medical support, and mediation services with the expectation of equitable cooperation. She paused briefly, not for effect, but because the statement did not require elaboration. That expectation was not met. There was no accusation in her tone. No escalation. Just a conclusion. We are not here to renegotiate those terms. The meaning of that line settled quickly. This was not a dispute. This was not a negotiation. This was a transition. We are announcing the formation of a new cooperative framework, the Terran Compact. The name appeared beside her, simple, unembellished. This framework is open to all sovereign systems choosing to operate outside the conclave structure. Membership is voluntary. Participation is equal. No member will hold veto authority over another based on size, age, or economic influence. In the conclave chamber, several representatives shifted at that line. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was unfamiliar. Dispute resolution will be conducted through neutral arbitration, not procedural delay. Infrastructure access, including relay networks, freight routes, and medical supply systems, will be shared among members without preferential restriction. She wasn't criticizing the conclave directly. She didn't need to. The contrast spoke for itself. We will continue building, Lena said. We will continue operating. And we will continue offering cooperation to those who choose to engage under these terms. She paused once more, briefly. The choice is yours. The transmission ended. There was no follow-up, no open channel for response, no invitation for immediate dialogue. Just silence. The reaction was not immediate, and it didn't need to be. The message had not been designed to provoke, it had been designed to resonate. Within hours, the conclave communications desk began receiving inquiries. Not protests or condemnations, but questions. Requests for clarification. Terms of access. Membership conditions. By the end of the first cycle, 7 independent systems had submitted formal expressions of interest. They were not the largest powers or the most influential blocs. They were systems that had experienced delay, systems that depended on stability, systems that had just learned what absence felt like. They're not competing with us, one council member said quietly during an emergency session. Velker did not respond immediately. He was watching the numbers. 7 became 11. 11 became 16. Each addition small on its own, but cumulative. Structural. They're replacing us, another voice said. This time, Velker nodded. Not because it sounded dramatic, but because it was accurate. The Terran Compact was not an attack. It was not rebellion. It was not even opposition. It was an alternative. And alternatives, once proven functional, did not need permission to grow. The conclave did not collapse. That was the first thing everyone noticed. There was no sudden failure, no dramatic dissolution of authority, no moment where the system simply stopped. Sessions continued. Votes were held. Policies were discussed and recorded just as they had been for thousands of years. From the outside, it still looked intact. But something fundamental had changed. The difference was not in what remained. It was in what no longer mattered. Trade routes that had once depended on conclave coordination began shifting toward Terran Compact channels. Not all at once, not universally, but steadily. Systems that joined the compact reported shorter delays, more predictable logistics, and access to infrastructure that functioned without negotiation cycles. Medical supply chains followed. Then relay access agreements. Then arbitration requests. Each transition small on its own. Each one reversible. But collectively, directional. Within a year, the conclave still governed hundreds of systems. But fewer of them relied on it. Within 5, the balance had shifted enough that internal debates began to sound different. Not about expansion or authority, but about relevance. Committees formed to study compact operations. Proposals were drafted to modernize conclave procedures, many of them resembling, in quieter language, the principles the compact had already implemented. Velker Thane read those proposals in silence. Not because they were flawed. Because they were late. Across the corridor networks, Terran-built relay systems expanded outward, linking compact member worlds into a structure that did not require central approval to function. Freight moved. Supplies arrived. Disputes were resolved without delay cycles measured in years. There was no announcement declaring victory. No statement marking transition. Just a system that worked. And another that remembered when it had. On Meridian Station, Lena Arcturus stood at the observation window, watching a line of cargo vessels move in steady formation across the dark. Their transponders carried identifiers from multiple species now, different worlds, different histories, operating under a shared framework that had not existed a year before. Rian Patel stood beside her. "They're still debating," he said quietly. "Whether to engage. Whether to adapt." Lena nodded once. "They will," she said. "Eventually." Rian glanced at her. "And if they don't?" She watched the ships continue their path, uninterrupted. "Then they won't need to." There was no satisfaction in her voice. No bitterness. Just clarity. Humanity had not forced change. They had built something that made the old system optional. And once something becomes optional, it begins, slowly and inevitably, to fade. Lena turned from the window and walked back toward the operations floor, where maps updated in real time and schedules adjusted continuously to meet demand. There was no ceremony waiting for her there. No recognition. No conclusion. Only work. Because the decision had already been made. Not in the chamber. Not in the withdrawal. But in what came after. Humanity had stopped asking to be included. Stopped waiting to be heard. Stopped measuring progress against a system that had never truly seen them. They had simply moved forward. And they did not look back.